The bell over the glass door gave its small, tired jingle, like it had been doing the same honest work longer than I had. And I looked up from the register with that practiced smile I could summon even when my feet were already aching. It was late afternoon, the kind of November light that made the mall's skylights look bruised, and our little department store seemed to hum with the soft friction of hangers and winter coats being unzipped. He came in slowly, not furtive exactly, but careful. A quiet man, in a brown wool coat that had seen better years, a knit cap pulled down despite the warmth inside. He wasn't old, mid-30s maybe, but he carried himself like someone who'd gotten used to moving without drawing attention, like his shoulders were trained to apologize for taking up space. My name tag caught a strip of fluorescent glare. Janice, in blocky black letters on white plastic. I adjusted it without thinking, smoothed the edge of my blouse, and watched him pause at the end of the hosiery aisle, as if the sheer packages were a shelf of delicate glass. At that time, 1999, pantyhose came in these shiny rectangles that promised miracles in careful fonts. Ultra sheer, control top, reinforced toe. The models on the front were all long legs and bright teeth, always stepping into a better life. The wall behind them was a grid of hooks and color-coded tags. We kept it neat, because nothing made customers angry faster than not finding their exact shade of suntan, or coffee, or barely black. He walked the length of the display, eyes moving in steady lines, reading. Not browsing, not killing time. Reading. When he turned toward the counter, he didn't meet my eyes right away. He stopped at the edge of the register, hands tucked into his coat pockets, and cleared his throat the way a man might before asking a stranger for directions. "Excuse me," he said. His voice was lower than I expected. Not gravelly, just restrained, like he was holding it with both hands. "Yes?" I leaned forward a little, friendly. "Can I help you find something?" He swallowed. 15-Denier. I blinked once, waiting for the rest of the sentence. Then I understood. 15-Denier Pantyhose? He nodded, a small movement. "If you have them." We did, of course. 15-Denier was the stuff of summer weddings and office dress codes, the kind that made you feel like you were wearing light itself. I reached for the side drawer where we kept the store map and coupons, but I didn't need either. I've been stocking that wall for years. "They're right over here," I said, coming around the counter. "Do you need a particular shade?" He hesitated, and for a heartbeat, I thought he might turn and leave. Then he said softly, "Barely black." The words fell like a confession even then, though I didn't know why. I led him down the aisle, the carpet muffling our steps. As I reached up to a hook and pulled down the package, I noticed his hands when he took it from me. Clean nails, the skin slightly dry, as if he washed them often. "Here you go," I said. 15-Denier, barely black. We've got control top and regular." Regular. He held the package in both hands like it was warm. I started to smile and ask if there was anything else, but he spoke first. 20. My eyebrows rose before I could stop them. 20-Denier? He nodded again. His cheeks had a faint flush, not dramatic, just a slow warmth rising. Also barely black. I turned back to the wall, found the 20-Denier section. The deniers were printed on little tabs, 10, 15, 20, 30, 40, and my fingers moved along them like I was playing a familiar scale. I handed him the next package. He didn't rush. He looked at it. He read the front. Then he said, 40. I glanced at him, really looked. There was no wedding ring, though there was a pale indentation on his finger where one might have been once. His eyes were a clear gray that made me think of winter sidewalks. 40-Denier, I repeated, mostly to give him room to change his mind. He lifted his gaze and met mine for the first time. The look wasn't bold, not challenging. It was bare, like a door cracked open to show there was someone behind it. "Yes," he said. 40. I nodded and pulled down a package of 15-Denier tights. These were thicker, more forgiving. The kind you wore in December when the wind off the parking lot cut straight through your coat. The kind you wore because you wanted to feel held together. I handed him the 40, and he took it with the same care. 3 packages now, stacked in his hands like a strange bouquet. Something in me shifted. Not pity, not curiosity exactly, but that little click you feel when you recognize a pattern and realize it isn't random. I'd seen men come in for hosiery before. Husbands sent by wives, boyfriends stumbling through with a crumpled note. Size B, suntan, control top. They made jokes, or they acted annoyed, or they did that exaggerated macho swagger like the pantyhose were contagious. This man wasn't doing any of that. He was reciting. "Do you want all 3? I asked gently. He exhaled through his nose, a sound that might have been a laugh in a different life. "I do," he said. "If that's not strange." "Not strange," I told him, and I meant it. A lot of people like different deniers for different things. He nodded as if absorbing this permission. When we walked back toward the counter, I noticed the way he moved. His steps were precise, careful not to bump the display tables, like he'd spent a lot of time trying not to be the reason anything toppled. At the register, he set the packages down and, with a kind of quiet insistence, lined them up by number. 15, 20, 40. I scanned the barcodes, the register beeping in little bright notes. "Are these for you?" slipped out of my mouth before I could catch it. I'd meant it neutrally, like I asked everyone if they wanted to open a store card. His face went still. I regretted it immediately. "You don't have to answer," I said quickly. "Sorry, habit." He stared at the counter for a moment, and in that pause the whole store seemed louder. The distant announcements from the mall, the soft pop of a hanger, the squeak of a cartwheel. Then he said, very quietly, "Yes." The word didn't come with drama. It was simply placed there, like a coin on a table. I kept my hands moving, folding the thin plastic bag open. "Okay," I said. "That's okay." He looked up again, eyes steady and tired. "Is it?" I didn't know him. I didn't know his story. But I knew what it felt like to want a part of yourself to be acceptable. I knew what it felt like to stand in front of a mirror and measure your body against what the world expected and come up short. "Yes," I said, and the steadiness surprised me. "It is." He let out a breath that seemed to come from someplace deep. His shoulders loosened a fraction. He paid in cash. $20 bills, smoothed flat as if he'd ironed them. When I handed him the change, our fingers brushed, and it was such a small contact, so ordinary, that I watched his hand twitch like he'd forgotten what ordinary touch felt like. He took the bag but didn't leave right away. He stood there as if the automatic doors might spit him out into a colder world. "I'm sorry," he said suddenly, voice tight. "I shouldn't. You don't have to apologize," I said. He looked around, as if afraid someone had heard. The hosiery aisle was empty. A woman in a puffy coat was debating sweaters in the next department, too far away to care. "I come here because," he began, and then he stopped. His jaw clenched, released. I waited. In retail, you learn patience the hard way. Waiting for checks to clear, waiting for the computer to unfreeze, waiting for customers to find the exact kind of cardigan they swear they bought last year. But this wasn't that. This was a different kind of waiting. Giving someone room to speak without grabbing the words for them. He swallowed. "Because it's quiet," he said, "and because, when I say the numbers, it feels like, I don't know, like I'm saying something true." 15, I said softly, half question, half echo. He nodded. 15 is like the first lie you tell, but it's a gentle one. It's almost nothing. You can pretend it's just, I don't know, warmth. But you feel it. I didn't laugh. I didn't make a face. I just listened. Because the way he said it, like he'd rehearsed it alone in the car, made it sacred. 20, he continued, eyes on the edge of the counter. 20 is when you stop pretending it's an accident. You feel it. You know it. You decide. I felt my throat tighten. The fluorescent lights above us buzzed faintly, as if the building itself was holding its breath. And 40, he said, and this time he looked straight at me. 40 is peace. Or it's supposed to be. It's weight. It's like someone puts a hand on your back and says, "You can stand up now." My chest ached with something tender and sharp. "What's your name?" I asked, because it felt wrong to let him be a stranger in the middle of that kind of truth. He blinked, as if surprised I wanted it. "Phil," he said. "It's Phil." "Janice," I told him, tapping my name tag lightly. "Hi, Phil." A small smile tried to form on his mouth and faltered, like his face was out of practice. He looked down at the bag. "I don't know why I'm telling you this." "Maybe because I asked?" I said gently. He shook his head. "No. People ask questions all the time. It doesn't mean I answer." He paused, then added, "I haven't said it out loud to anyone. Not like this." Something about that, the loneliness implied in the sentence, made a decision in me before I could overthink it. I'd spent years being polite, being professional, keeping my life in neat compartments. But there was a person standing in front of me who had, for whatever reason, decided this moment was safe enough to open. "I get off at 6, I said, and my voice came out more casual than my heartbeat felt. "There's a coffee place in the mall, by the bookstore. If you want, if you'd like to sit somewhere that isn't under fluorescent lights." His eyes widened slightly, suspicion and hope tangling together. "You don't have to," I added quickly. If you want." Phil stared at me, and I could see the gears turning, the list of reasons to say no. Danger, shame, inconvenience, fear. Then he nodded once, slow. "Coffee," he repeated, like testing the word. "Coffee," I confirmed, and smiled again, this time without the retail polish. "If that's okay." "It's okay," he said, and the way he used my own word back at me felt like a fragile bridge. He left then, the bell jingling behind him, and I watched him disappear into the river of mall traffic. My hands were shaking when I turned back to the register. I hid them by straightening a stack of receipts I didn't need to straighten. All through the rest of my shift, I kept seeing those denier numbers in my head like stepping stones. 15, 20, 40. I kept thinking about what he'd said, about how peace could be measured in increments of nylon thickness. At 6 o'clock, I clocked out, shrugged on my coat, and walked toward the bookstore cafe with a nervousness that felt teenage and ridiculous. I was 32 years old. I dated men who loved the idea of me, but not the actual person who took up space, who had opinions, who wanted more than a polite dinner and a key turned in the front door. Phil was already there, sitting at a small round table with his hands wrapped around a paper cup, like it was an anchor. He'd taken off his cap. His hair was dark, thinning at the temples, combed carefully. He looked up when I approached and stood abruptly, knocking his knee against the table. "Sorry," he said, and winced. "It's fine," I said, sitting across from him. "Did you get something?" "Black coffee," he said. "I didn't want to complicate it." I smiled, and he looked relieved, as if the smile had given him a map. I ordered a latte because I was always trying to make life taste sweeter than it was, then came back and settled in. The bookstore around us smelled like paper and cinnamon pastries. Soft music played overhead, something instrumental that tried to make the mall feel cultured. Phil stared into his coffee. "You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to," I said. I'm not a therapist. I'm just a woman who sells hosiery." A quiet sound escaped him, almost laughter. That might be the safest kind of person. He took a sip, then set the cup down with care. I started buying them when I was, I don't know, 21, 22. I'd go to a store far from where I lived, pay cash, keep the bag hidden under the seat. He looked up at me briefly, checking for disgust. I kept my face open. At first it wasn't about sex, he said, and his voice sharpened with the need to be understood correctly. It was about quiet, about feeling contained, like my skin finally had a boundary. I nodded slowly, like a hug you can put on. His eyes widened, startled. Yes, he breathed. Exactly. He kept talking, halting at first, then steadier. How he'd grown up in a house where boys were boys and anything else was weakness. How he'd learned early to hide softness behind jokes, behind sports, behind a voice that stayed low. How he'd married young. She was kind, he said, and the sadness in his mouth made my chest tighten. How she'd found a pair once and laughed, thinking it was a prank, and how he'd laughed too, because that was what kept you safe. How did it end? I asked softly. He traced the rim of his cup with one finger. It didn't end because of that, he said. It ended because I couldn't stop disappearing inside myself. She thought I didn't love her. I did, I didn't know how to be a person she could reach. Do you know now? I asked before I could stop myself. He looked at me for a long moment. I don't know, he admitted. I'm trying. There was a silence then. Not awkward, just full. People passed by with shopping bags. Someone laughed loudly near the pastry case. The world went on, indifferent and ordinary, while something fragile unfolded at our small table. Do you want to be Phil? I asked, surprising myself with the question. Or is there more? His eyes flickered, and for a second he looked like he might bolt. I don't know what I am, he said, voice almost inaudible. I only know what makes the noise in my head stop. I know what makes me feel aligned, for a little while. Peace, I murmured, thinking of 15-Denier. He swallowed. Peace, he repeated, and his voice cracked on the word. I reached across the table, slowly, giving him time to pull away, and rested my hand near his, not touching yet. He stared at my fingers like they were an offering. Is it okay if I touch your hand? I asked. His breath hitched. Then he nodded, eyes shining in a way that made my own vision blur. I placed my hand over his. His skin was warm and slightly rough. His fingers trembled under mine. There, I said softly. That's real too. Phil closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, something in his face had softened, as if he'd been holding a grimace so long he'd forgotten his muscles could do anything else. We talked until the bookstore announced it was closing. Not a sweeping, cinematic conversation, just two people trading pieces of their lives like small, careful gifts. I told him about my own quiet things, how I'd wanted to be a singer when I was younger and had let someone else's laughter shut that door. How I'd stayed in retail because it was predictable. How loneliness could live in a crowded place like the mall. When we stood to leave, he hovered near me, uncertain. Thank you, he said. You don't have to thank me, I replied, but I understood why he did. In a world that demanded you stay in your assigned shape, kindness felt like a rare currency. Outside, the air was cold enough to sting. The parking lot lights threw pale circles onto the asphalt. We walked toward our cars, steps crunching over grit and old leaves. Will I see you again? I asked, and my voice sounded braver than my heart. Phil stopped, hands in his coat pockets, and looked at me with that same bare honesty. If you want, he said. I don't want to impose. You're not imposing, I told him. I'm inviting. The word seemed to land in him. He nodded once, firm. Then yes, he said. I'd like that. We started small. That was the only way it could have worked. He came into the store again the next week, the bell jingling, his eyes scanning the hosiery wall like it was a familiar prayer. I was on shift, and when he reached the counter, he didn't recite numbers right away. He just said, "Hi, Janice." "Hi, Phil," I replied, and the warmth that spread through me surprised me with its steadiness. Sometimes he bought hosiery. Sometimes he didn't. Sometimes he just walked with me on my break, and we ate pretzels from the mall kiosk and talked about nothing. Movies, weather, the ridiculous music playing in the food court. The more ordinary we let it be, the safer it became. One evening in December, after we'd been meeting for a month, he asked if we could go somewhere other than the mall. His voice shook when he said it, but his eyes stayed on mine. "My apartment," he added quickly. Nothing, just, "I want to show you something. If you're comfortable." "Only if you're comfortable," I said. He nodded. "I want to be." His apartment was small, clean, and sparsely decorated, like he'd been afraid to leave too much evidence of himself. A couch, a small TV, books stacked neatly. But when he led me down the hall toward the bedroom, I noticed his breathing speed up, like he was approaching a cliff. He stopped at the bedroom door, hand on the knob, and looked at me. "I can't do this if you're going to laugh," he said, voice brittle. "I won't," I promised. "And if you change your mind, we stop. No explanations needed." He nodded, eyes wet, and opened the door. On the bed, laid out with careful symmetry, were 3 packages of pantyhose, 15, 20, 40, like the ones he'd bought that first day. Beside them, folded neatly, was a soft sweater in a muted blue. Not flashy, not a costume, just clothing chosen with longing. "I don't know what I'm doing," he whispered. "You're trying," I said, and stepped closer, not touching him yet. "What do you want?" Phil swallowed. "I want to feel quiet," he said. "I want to feel like I can breathe in my own body." I nodded. "Okay." He stood there for a long moment, then reached for the 15-Denier package with hands that trembled. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if each step required permission. I stayed near, offering my presence but not my hands unless he asked. He disappeared into the bathroom for a minute, and I heard the soft sound of drawers opening, closing. When he came out, he was still Phil, still the same face, the same eyes, but something in his posture had changed. He wore the blue sweater, and beneath it the faint contour of tights under his jeans. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a transformation into someone else. It was the smallest shift toward alignment, like a picture frame straightened on a wall. He stood in the doorway, waiting for my reaction, eyes wide with fear. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. "You look comfortable," I said. Phil's mouth trembled and he blinked hard. "Do I?" "Yes," I told him. "You look like you can finally unclench." A sound escaped him then, half laugh, half sob, and he covered his face with both hands, shoulders shaking. Without rushing, I stepped closer. "Is it okay if I hug you?" I asked. He nodded, and when I wrapped my arms around him, he held on like he'd been falling for years and had finally found something solid. We didn't do anything explicit. There was no sudden leap into romance like a movie would want. We sat on the edge of his bed, and he told me about the first time he'd ever tried on pantyhose, about the shame that had followed him like a shadow, about how he'd started to believe peace was something other people got. "I don't even know if I'm allowed," he said, voice muffled. "Allowed by who?" I asked gently. He shrugged helplessly, and we both understood the answer. By everyone. By culture. By the invisible rules that punished different. "You're allowed," I said, and I meant it in the same steady way I'd meant it at the register. "Your peace isn't hurting anyone." He looked at me then, eyes glossy, and there was something new in his expression. Not just gratitude, but a kind of cautious affection. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "Being kind to me?" I thought about it. About how kindness wasn't always a grand moral choice. Sometimes it was simply recognizing your own hunger in someone else. Because you're a person, I said, and you deserve someone who doesn't treat your truth like a joke. Phil's gaze dropped to my mouth and then back to my eyes, as if he was asking a question without words. I felt my own heartbeat thud in my throat. "Is it okay if I kiss you?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. The consent in the question, so careful, so respectful, made something in me soften all the way open. "Yes," I said, and leaned in. The kiss was gentle, not hungry, not urgent. Just two people testing whether tenderness could exist here. His lips were warm, and he trembled against me like a violin string. When we pulled apart, he looked at me as if I'd rewritten a rule he'd believed was carved in stone. We built from there, slowly, like you build a fire you don't want to extinguish with too much kindling at once. There were hard days, days when he went quiet again, when shame returned with its familiar claws. Days when he called me and said, "I can't do this." And I said, "Okay," and meant, "We can pause, we can breathe, I'm still here." Days when I had to admit my own fears, of what people would think, of what it meant to attach my life to someone who was still discovering their shape. But there were bright days, too. Days when he walked with me through the mall and didn't flinch at the hosiery wall. Days when he bought 15-Denier not like a secret, but like a choice. Days when he laughed, really laughed, and it sounded like someone had opened a window in a room that had been closed for years. On a snowy evening in February, he came into the store just before closing. The mall was quiet, the kind of quiet that made the tiled corridors feel like empty rivers. He stood at the counter while I counted out the register drawer. "Janice?" he said. I looked up. "Yeah?" He held out a small paper bag. "I bought something," he said, voice uncertain. "Not here. Somewhere else." I set the money aside, curiosity stirring. "Okay." He placed the bag on the counter and slid it toward me. Inside was a single package of pantyhose, 15-Denier, barely black. I looked at him, confused. "It's not for you," he said quickly, then shook his head. "I mean, it's not because I want you to wear it, it's—" He swallowed hard. "It's because I want to share the poetry. I want it to be something we can both hold without it being shame." The tenderness of that made my eyes burn. I reached into the bag and held the package. The model's smiling legs looked absurdly cheerful under the harsh store lights. 20, I said softly. Phil's shoulders eased. 20, he echoed. I stepped around the counter and stood in front of him. "You know," I said, voice low, "you don't have to measure peace in deniers forever." He looked at me, brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "I mean," I said, and my hands rose slowly until they rested on his forearms. Another ask without words, another permission he could deny. He didn't. "Maybe someday you'll just have peace. No numbers, no packages, just you." Phil's eyes filled, and he nodded like the idea was both impossible and everything he wanted. "I want that," he whispered. "I want that for you too," I said. He leaned his forehead against mine, right there in the hosiery department, surrounded by bright rectangles of nylon and the quiet hum of retail life. When I think back on that first day, the bell, the bruised November light, the way he said 15 like it was a prayer, I realize how close he was to turning around and leaving without being seen. How easy it would have been for me to make a joke, to let discomfort cover kindness like a coat. Instead, we stood there, two ordinary people at a counter, and made a small, stubborn decision. To let peace be real, even if it came wrapped in plastic and printed with a number. 15, 20, 40. Not just deniers in the end. Steps. And the strange, beautiful way love sometimes begins, not with fireworks, not with certainty, but with a quiet man asking for something soft, and a woman behind a counter deciding to answer him like he mattered.